Good morning, everyone. My name is Sebastian Padilla Ochoa. You can call me Danny or Daniel. I am the Florida Conservation Senior Manager for Ocean Conservancy. Ocean Conservancy is the nation's oldest marine conservation nonprofit in the country. We work at the federal, state, and local levels to effectuate change and improve the health of our marine environment. Locally, I lead projects and implementation of on-the-ground ideas with municipal and county governments to harmonize the relationship between the natural and built environment. Naturally, a lot of my projects, if not all, have implications on climate change manifestations and opportunities for mitigation of these challenges. Mobility and streets present really kind of opportunistic challenges, right? We have the opportunity to not only address the needs of our community and support the infrastructure of our communities, but at the same time, we have the perfect place to implement and innovate through how we change and how do we deal with climate change. Streets represent half of all land and a third of impervious surfaces in most cities, which by the numbers means that we really need to start focusing on how we build our mobility in our streets. Usually you see these as the manifestation of stormwater, right? Streets carry and are designed to carry the stormwater, but they also present an opportunity to figure out where are we leading that stormwater, for example. And of course, climate change manifestations are not limited to sea level rise or more increased flooding or more frequent sunny day flooding and prolonged heat waves, but those are definitely the ones that we talk about the most in Florida. Through this approach, through comprehensive policies and effective leadership and innovative design and planning, we have the place here today actually to start some of those ideas and shift our streets and mobility networks to be more climate resilient and be more holistic in the way that we plan for them. We have a fantastic panel that I'm very excited to introduce. We will hear from them in the order that I'm going to introduce them. First, I'm going to open up so I don't get anything wrong. We have the Honorable Commissioner Oliver Gilbert III, the Miami-Dade TPO Governing Board Chairman and the Board of County Commissioners Vice Chairman. Oliver Gilbert III was born and raised in the city of Miami Gardens and is a graduate of Florida A&M University. He also attended the University of Miami School of Law, where he graduated with honors. In 2012, Chairman Gilbert was elected mayor of his hometown, where his efforts helped his city earn the All-American City Award in 2020. In November 2020, he was sworn in as the Miami-Dade County Commissioner's District 1 representative and was unanimously chosen as vice chairman of the Board of County Commissioners. After Commissioner Gilbert, we will hear from Billy Fields. Billy Fields is the author of Adaptation, Urbanism, and Resilient Communities and professor at the Texas State University. Billy Fields has a PhD and is an associate professor of political science at the Texas State University. His research focuses on understanding the key elements of resilient communities. He is the lead author of Adaptation, Urbanism, and Resilient Communities, as I mentioned, and co-editor of the Transport Beyond Oil. He directs the iSTEP, an annual study abroad program in the Netherlands, exploring best practices in active transportation. Last but certainly not least, a personal friend of mine, we have Jane Gilbert, the Chief Heat Officer of Miami-Dade County. As Miami-Dade County's first Chief Heat Officer, Ms. Gilbert works across departments and partners to address the increasing risks to human health, lives, and livelihoods associated with extreme heat. Prior to joining the county, Ms. Gilbert served as the city's of Miami's first Chief Resilience Officer for 4 years. Prior to her public service, Jane had led 3 nonprofits and managed ESG work for large corporations. Please, let's invite our speakers to the stage with a round of applause, and we hear from Commissioner Gilbert first.
They gave me some first, let me just say this. When I got up earlier, he wasn't here, but I know he's here now. Mayor Bob Weinroth of Palm Beach County. You all give him a round of applause. He is the mayor of Palm Beach County. He's also the chair of the TPO, their version of TPO up there. And so definitely welcome. I understand the train was late. It's fine. Blame Euless Cleckley. He's right there, Euless Cleckley, our director, our CEO of Transit in Miami-Dade County. He joins us. Give him a round of applause also. All right. Now, if you all know Eileen Bouclé, she gave me some very, very, very specific things to say, and so I'm going to say them right off the bat. We're going to get those out of the way. So first, we've learned an extraordinary amount of lessons, and we've incorporated all of them in our Resilient 305 strategy, the SMART plan, our climate action strategy, and the 2045 Miami-Dade long-range transportation plan. All of those things work together, and they embrace resiliency. Also, the SMART plan will enhance our economy and improve the quality of our communities, provide accessibility and connectivity for a more comprehensive transportation network for all users, and provide reliable mobility choices that are resilient for residents and tourists. And so, having gotten that out of the way, I think that we just probably ought to talk about resiliency generally for a second. Because it occurred to me as I was sitting and I was listening to your presentation, is that we need to commonly experience the problem so we can commonly solve the problem. And the issue is that we all understand that there's an issue. We're not approaching something that's catastrophic. We're in the middle of something that's catastrophic. We're not breaking the planet. We've already broken the planet. The question is, can we remediate what we've done? And so we can only do that if we collectively experience it, because from that collective experience, then we can all embrace what's going to be a difficult transition, but it's going to have to be a collective solution. I think it was Einstein, and Eileen loves quoting Einstein. He said, you can't solve a problem with the same consciousness that created the problem. If you put that in these terms, we can't build more roads and fix the environment at the same time. We just can't do it. We can't continue to think, believe, act, exist in the ways that places the planet in peril. So I appreciated your presentation. You said put people first. It's not people. Put the future first. We're trying to ensure a future for our children, which is what our parents strive to ensure for us. But first and foremost in that calculation has to be how we design an economy, a culture, a community, a country, and a world around resiliency, around the idea that we have been poor stewards of this planet. And we have to be better. If we don't become better, we won't have a planet. If we don't become better, we won't actually be able to pass on what was passed on to us. And in Miami-Dade County, that's the most beautiful place in the world to live. It's extraordinary. And to put a finer point on it, if you don't care about the planet, care about the fact that in places like this, it's costing the country $1 billion a day. Listen, climate change, sea level rise is an existential threat to everything in Miami-Dade County. I'm fond of telling the people in Miami Gardens, where I live, which is inland, there's no such thing as inland in Miami-Dade County. Sea level rise isn't a problem for Bal Harbor and Miami Beach and Surfside. No, it's a problem for all of us. And if you don't care about the water coming in closer, care about the fact that as the water comes in closer, the jobs will go away. When the jobs go away, our social norms will deteriorate. Our quality of lives will plummet. And the place that we live and exist in, that we love, will fundamentally change forever. Look, we are at an inflection point. And it's going to be us who become prophets of the idea that change isn't something that we want to do. Change is just something that we have to do. So when we talk about the SMART plan, the SMART plan is just us coming together as a community and saying, hey, we were actually dumb before. Yeah, that's really what it is. We said build houses wherever you want to. We didn't care about mass transit in a meaningful way. We said we wanted it, but you need to define want in a different way. Want means, I want something means I am willing to pay for it. I want something means I'm willing to go through the process of experiencing change to embrace it. So when we said we want the SMART plan, no, we need the SMART plan. We need to embrace mass transit. We need more people having options that bring them out of their cars. And yes, cars are with us for the foreseeable future. But I don't say forever because people who say that we're going to do something forever, well, I know they're wrong immediately. I appreciate you all, and I look forward to speaking with you all as I can. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today. I'm Billy Fields from Texas State University, and you may ask, how did someone from Texas State University get to talk to you today in Miami? I wrote a book called Adaptation, Urbanism, and Adaptation Urbanism looks at how we can change. The commissioner talked about the need for change. I'm going to talk a little bit about what bouncing forward looks like. Let's see if I can figure out how to, hey, there we were, it worked. So the book includes John Rennie from Florida Atlantic University, so he's from right in the area here. I'll include some examples from the South Florida area, but I'll also include some examples from around the world. So I'll give you some ideas about what resilient streets really are. But the first part we're going to deal with is the policy problem. We've dealt with a little bit of that so far, and we're going to delve into it a little bit more deeply. So the first thing, as you all know, is that sea level rise and increasing heavy rains are a problem. My colleague John Rennie modeled high tide lines in the year 2100. This is in Fort Lauderdale, and what you really see here is potential for something really bad to happen. I want to focus on the idea of potential, however, because this is what happens if we keep moving with a high emissions strategy. If we keep doing what we're already doing, this is what the world could look like. So what we need to do from a resilience perspective is not just adapt to what's coming, but decrease our emissions. Climate adaptation and climate mitigation are at the core of that. So what we need to do is figure out what our streets look like to address these issues. I gave a couple facts here. If current emission trends continue, 50% likelihood that there'll be a greater than sea level rise by the year 2100. Essentially, that came out this week from NOAA. So these facts and figures are coming at us quickly, and we need to begin to figure out what that looks like to address it. In addition, from a transportation perspective, the business as usual trends don't look good for us in terms of crash fatalities. What we've seen during the pandemic is, strangely, as you all know, a rise of fatalities and injuries. As you basically got rid of congestion on the roadways, people went faster. And what we've seen is a dramatic increase in fatalities. In addition, transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. I looked it up recently. I think in the Miami area, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 45% of your greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation sector. So if we're going to take climate change seriously, we need to address transportation. Transportation's at the core of that. And then we talked a little bit about how much space cars take up. Cars take up anywhere from about 30% of city space. When you add parking on top of it, it can go up to 50% of city space. Cars are just really spatially inefficient to move people around in tight urban areas. Rethinking how we use that city space gives us an opportunity to think about something different. So I just talked about all the negative things that are there, but we also have this opportunity to rethink. We're not going to move from a climate change perspective with fear. We're going to move because people want to move to something better. And what we see with resilient streets is the opportunity to re-envision what those streets look like and give ourselves more livable communities. So I define this in the book as this kind of idea of streets of the past and then streets of the future. So our streets of the past are what we've been doing for the last 75 years. Streets of the past have high traffic speeds. They privilege distance over the people who live in them. We've talked a little bit about that so far today. They have a high fatality rate, and there's lots of impervious surfaces. So from a water management perspective, we're covering our communities in these roads and parking areas, and the water's just flowing off. And then finally, they generate the highest amount of carbon. Imagine that we bounced forward. We bounced forward to something different, to a street of the future, where we had lower traffic speeds, where we privileged accessibility to people close by. We used transit for longer trips. We aim towards Vision Zero, where we're creating a much, much safer system. And then we have sponge surfaces that absorb water. And finally, we're creating a transportation system that decreases our greenhouse gas emissions. That's the future that we want. The question of how do we get there, I heard in the beginning there was a slide, everyone kind of poked in what they thought was the most important issue preventing us from looking at resilient streets. And politics was the #1 thing that popped up. We know what resilient streets look like. We have a political challenge to figure out what to do about it. So what I'm going to do is give you some examples from around the world, kind of visual case studies to show you what that looks like. And we'll define what a resilient street looks like to figure out how to bounce forward. So in the book, what we did is we surveyed the literature, and we found that there were 4 characteristics, kind of best practice model from around the world, where you basically managed water and adaptation, and at the same time decreased greenhouse gas emissions. This model we called adaptation urbanism. We have to have a technical term for something, right? I'm an academic, it's my gig. So 4 aspects of adaptation urbanism, and you've heard these components so far. Compact communities and compact development. We need to be a little bit closer. It doesn't need to look like Manhattan, but it needs to look like we're a little bit closer together. We also need sustainable transportation options, walking, biking, and transit to move around if we want to decrease our greenhouse gas emissions. And then the thing that creates the amenities to our communities are really the green and blue infrastructure. Weaving green spaces within our communities creates that compact development that's desirable density. It also helps you manage water. And finally, when you do all that, it creates potentially equity challenges. These are really, really attractive places to be. I used to work I'm from New Orleans originally, and we worked on the Lafitte Greenway project after Hurricane Katrina, and it was a disaster, and it was terrible, and we thought, oh, we'll build a greenway right through the heart of the community. It will do all these great things. And we didn't put affordable housing at the core of our project. We did it later. That was a mistake. You need to put affordable housing at the start of these type of projects because it will be successful. These are the type of things people want. They're desired and they're amenities, and putting affordable housing at the core of it needs to be there. So that's what we found from a best practice perspective. And really the idea is that we're going to link climate mitigation and climate adaptation together and identify what that looks like around the world. So to do that, we needed to define what resilient streets are. And this is where things get actually fairly simple. Resilient streets are 2 things. They are safe systems design, kind of a Vision Zero design, and they're adding green infrastructure. This is where the politics comes in, right? This is the hard part. We know what this looks like. So safe systems design, basically the Netherlands and Sweden in the 1990s basically changed the way they were going to design their streets. I spend a lot of time in the Netherlands, so I'm going to talk about their system. It's called Safe Systems or Sustainable Safety. It's basically the same thing as Vision Zero. Look at the chart here. What you see is that in the 1970s, the Netherlands and the United States were very, very similar in terms of our fatalities. They made a change, and what you see is way fewer fatalities and serious injuries. And now, walking and biking are about the same level as cars in terms of fatalities. There are no vulnerable users in the Netherlands because they designed them away. And I'll show you what that design looks like in a minute. But we have an opportunity to do that if we design our streets better. And what it looks like is 2 things. When you design for safety in an urban area, you do 2 things. First thing you do is that in residential areas, you traffic calm the streets. Gabe talked a little bit earlier about the Barcelona superblock or super isla system. I like the super island. I think that's a nicer way to talk about it. But this super island system is actually based on the Dutch model, basically where they create neighborhood streets that are traffic calmed. And somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to 75% of all Dutch residential streets are traffic calmed. Took a while, it took decades, but what you see is an incredibly safe system. And it looks like this image from Delft at the bottom here on the left. And then the second thing that you do is on higher speed streets above about 25, 30 miles an hour, you add cycle tracks, you add protected spaces. That's the story. Like we're gonna talk a lot more about how to do this, but if you do this, you create a system, a safe system. And if you don't, you create a less safe system. So we have a political choice. Do we want to create a safe system that looks like this, that shows you those decreasing fatalities, decreasing injuries, and increasing quality of life? or do we want to continue with our business as usual trends? The second thing that you want to do is add green and blue infrastructure to soak up water, to address the urban heat island effect, and to create these livable communities. I was out in Copenhagen right before the pandemic, and I came across this street. I called it Protected Bike Lanes 2.0. My Danish is really terrible. It's like Bolsojov or something street. But it's fantastic. They were actually building it while I was there. There's a buffered bioswale, which you see the green space there. It's designed to soak up water. And then it buffers the cycle track. And what you saw immediately was people using this space. It was nice, it was beautiful, and it served our climate adaptation needs. Now, one facility like that isn't going to do a whole lot, but putting those pieces together is really going to do it. And so far, I've defined resilient streets, and really resilient streets are the foundation of great places. And somehow, I've almost gone over my time because I'm an academic. So maybe we should end here on this idea of a foundation for great places. Resilient streets are this foundation for great places. We can do this. And I'll finish just with a quick image here from Copenhagen. This is what you can do. This is an old traffic circle. They turned it into a resilience district, and it moved and changed into an urban forest. This is the exact same location for both of these pictures. I went in 2017 and then 2019. Families with kids moving through. There's a new cafe on the side. It's beautiful. And the way they did it is through this resilience district or pilot model. We could begin piloting these type of projects around our cities and then create Vision Zero, green infrastructure, build it together, and define what these type of projects look in Copenhagen, but then also in our own communities. And with that, I'll leave it. I had more, but we can talk more about that later. I really appreciate it. So thank you so much.
So we heard a lot about resilient streets from Dr. Fields here, which was great. And I'm really going to focus on how we integrate thinking about heat to make resilient streets. We know a lot about flood risk in Miami. We're known nationally, internationally for our flood risk and sea level rise. Heat has been a silent killer, and that's the thing that we're going to focus on today is how do we integrate that to make it. And really what my role is, this is a new role, it's taken a lot of attention as a chief heat officer, how it fits within the larger framework of resilient streets and resilient cities, and specifically how we integrate it with safe and resilient streets. So across the US, heat is the #1 killer of any weather-related disaster, more than floods, more than hurricanes, more than forest fires. And it's something that here locally, we've known heat a long time. We have this combination of relatively high heat, but a lot of humidity, which creates a very high heat index. That leads to, can be just minor discomfort of cramps or feeling faint, but it can also lead to major exhaustion and even heat stroke and death. And so that can be quite dangerous, particularly for certain groups. Pregnant women and young children have a harder time regulating heat, so do older adults. People with certain pre-existing conditions on certain prescriptive drugs, people with heart and lung diseases, with diabetes, can be more vulnerable to that heat. And certainly there are more people who are more exposed day in and day out. In Miami-Dade County, we have over 300,000 outdoor workers who are exposed to heat every day. I'm sure throughout South Florida it's quite high. So people are most at risk outdoors in any environment, whether they're working out, recreating, partying, whatever. That's where they're most vulnerable. Trying to wait for a bus in a bus stop, walking on the street. They're also vulnerable at home. With increasing heat, we're paying more for our utility costs, and we have with our housing burden, we also have an equally high utility burden here, with both the increasing price of electricity as well as the need for using more AC. Like I mentioned before, in South Florida, we know heat. This is the trend line here in Miami-Dade County of temperature over the last 50 years or so. Since 1985, our average minimum temperature has raised a little over 2 degrees Fahrenheit or a degree centigrade. That makes the minimum temperature is how we recover at night, and that is projected to continue to increase 4 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit in the next 80 years. And as I mentioned, really our ability to regulate heat is really, we need to look at heat index, not just temperature. So that combination of humidity and temperature. And here in Miami, we currently have a lot of days over 90 degrees heat index, but by mid-century it's going to be over half the year. And we currently only have about 7 days where we have a heat index of 105, but by mid-century, that goes to almost 3 months a year. And that is when a heat index of 105 is when all people are vulnerable if they're continued exposed at any amount of time. Even just over 90 degrees, if you're out there exerting a lot of energy, either working or recreating, you're vulnerable. We also have the compound risk. We have a lot of air conditioning throughout Miami-Dade County and South Florida. But if we had a widespread and extended power outage during a summer month, say with a hurricane, we can have big dangers. This was Hurricane Irma, where we had 12 deaths in a assisted living facility, in a nursing home, in Broward County. And thankfully, our state did act after that and pass a law requiring all assisted living and nursing homes to have the backup power to keep a room cool. Well, we know we have a lot more people vulnerable than those in those homes in the event of this. So we also know that people are at risk in their homes and at work. The Union of Concerned Scientists, it's not just a health risk, it's an economic risk, both to employers and the employees. Lost wage time is already causing the state over $1.2 million in lost wages every year. That's projected to go over 6 million, even if we just do, if we act slowly, could be over 8 million by mid-century a year. And it's not just climate change that's creating higher temperatures here in South Florida and in Miami-Dade County. It's our urbanization, it's our development patterns. And those development patterns create more heat unequally. We can have temperatures 10 degrees higher in areas with high pavement and low vegetation, low tree canopy. And those with higher tree canopy, so you see here the dark blue areas are higher income areas, the white areas are lower income areas in Miami-Dade County. The dark green areas on the right side are over 40% tree canopy, and the white areas are less than 10% tree canopy. So we have a real equity consideration as we build our right-of-ways as well. So a chief heat officer is really, Gabe Klein talked about that systemic thinking and integrated thinking and all the partners we need to bring. So my role is to have a heat lens on our work and work through public education, specific policies around outdoor workers, around housing retrofits, and streets and trees, and our emergency management. So the Adrienne Arsht Resilience Center, or Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, I should say, formed an Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance. They're an international think tank based in Washington, D.C., seeing the increasing risks of heat cities worldwide. And it was really out of a conversation with the main philanthropist, Adrienne Arsht, and Mayor Daniela Levine Cava, that they formed the idea of City Champions for Heat Action and the creation of the Chief Heat Officer position. And now there's a Chief Heat Officer in Athens, Greece, and Freetown, Sierra Leone. There's a heat officer in Phoenix, and there's soon to be one in Los Angeles. We'll see if we can continue to create that movement across this country and beyond. My work is going to be organized under a regional partnership. We heard from Chairman Gilbert earlier that about the Resilient 305 strategy, so it's built under that strategy. And will be integrated, and the county will continue to lead on the work of heat. It will be integrated with both our carbon mitigation and our overall adaptation strategy, which has been historically primarily focused on managing flood risk, as well as our environmental work to protect Biscayne Bay. So it's going to be very integrated also with our sea level rise strategy and our climate action strategy. Can't be done without multiple. We heard earlier the critical nature, bringing in your university, nonprofit partners, our healthcare sector, international and national partners to achieve what we need to do. And we have a task force, and I'm going to just do a brief plug. We have a series of public workshops going on to create our action plan, a 3-year action plan locally here, and we need your expertise. We're going to be having the workshop focused on streets and trees March 29th at 10:30. I invite you all to sign up at miamifoundation.org, Extreme Heat. You can sign up and participate. We're looking for all your input. And in preparation for that planning effort, we created a toolkit, and all of you can access that, both at the Miami Foundation Extreme Heat website or Miami-Dade County Extreme Heat. You can Google either, and you will find this toolkit, which goes through all the different kinds of integration, heat, both mitigation and heat management strategies that a municipality or county can take. And a lot of those have to do with our right-of-ways, for sure. So, as I said, my role is to improve coordination and accelerate efforts that are already underway. And we have our Director, Maria Nardi, from our Parks and Recreation here. Million Trees Miami has done an amazing job building partnerships, attracting corporate partnerships and foundation partnerships to plant trees in our parks and our right-of-ways, particularly focusing on playgrounds and bus stops. And they built a vision, not just for parks, but how our streets are linear parks and how they need to be connected. And Gabe Klein talked about putting pedestrians first. Well, here in South Florida, if we're going to put pedestrians first, we got to keep it cool on those streets, because they're not going to go out there and walk the streets and wait in those bus stops if we can't keep it cool. And so that's part of what the great streets are. We have a street tree master plan. We're going to be building on this great foundation that we already have here in the county, but really focusing on how we need to prioritize. We need trees. It's not easy to plant trees in the right-of-way. We've got a lot of challenges with our utility lines, with a lot of demands in the trees, but that doesn't mean that we give up. It means that we think more creatively and think out of the box and to make it happen. And you know, we are building the underline. We've committed to the Ludlam Trail. There's great momentum underway. This is the momentum that we need to accelerate. I think Gabe's right. We're at that pivot point of acceleration, and that's really what my role is to help build the thinking around heat into that acceleration pivot point. Thank you, and I look forward to our dialogue.
Thank you, Billy, Jane. As you noticed, we have a new guest. So Commissioner Eileen Higgins almost needs no introduction, but she is the chair of the Transportation, Mobility, and Planning Committee for the Miami-Dade County, thus is a fantastic context setter for a lot of the work that's happening in the county and representative of the region. I'm going to start a Q&A session. The first question that came through the audience, and again, I'll remind you, if you have any more questions, please input them through Slido, slido.com. And then you're going to have to put 3 S's, SSS 2022, to submit your question. The first question is a really pragmatic one, and it's geared at what are the challenges that are preventing more resilient, complete streets being incorporated across the region. I'm curious to hear from the different levels of, starting with government, and then the county, and then Billy from your expertise. Happy to go in that order, if left to right.
So I think initially, when I arrived on the county commission just shy of 4 years ago, I was the only commissioner that was a regular user of transit in all of its forms, whether it's the bus, the trolley, the Metro Mover, the Metro Rail. And for those of you that do use transit, you know that every transit trip begins in a pair of sneakers, right? Because you got to get there. And this is a county, and I think a region of the world that is undergoing an immense cultural transformation. This place was built with a strategy of build, 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 right? Which means houses, houses everywhere. We are not well known for fantastic urban planning. As Vice Chairman Gilbert said, we built it and then we said, oh, holy mackerel, what are we gonna do? Because the world is changing, right? Carbon emissions are no longer something we're proud of or should be proud of. One of the fastest ways to slow them the heck down is to get out of our cars. What we do know is low-income residents are out of their cars. They have no choice, right? They can't afford a car, or they work somewhere where they couldn't afford to park their car if they could get there. But the way to really reduce carbon emissions is to get more riders by choice out of their cars. And so that does require complete streets, whether that's onto transit or onto cycling or just out in your sneakers walking to and from the grocery store or work. So part of it is in South Florida because we have not traditionally been a densely built up place. The idea of a complete street is completely novel. I mean, you all are going to vote on some projects that, should a complete street be award winning? Well, I don't want to say that that's depressing, but that's depressing. Like, right, that should be totally normal. And we're not there yet. So part of it is the cultural change of our communities. Part of it is the cultural change and the mind shift of elected officials. And I can tell you on our county commission, since I've been there, there's a dramatic shift in shutting down streets for making sure we're building bicycle lanes, adding micromobility. We also are taking away parking for restaurants. That's not going away. The pandemic forced us to rethink how our streets are. So part of it's a mind shift, but then part of it's a regulatory shift, right? We have the MUTCD up in Washington, which for me is the most hated book I've ever read in my life. It's the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which is basically a design manual of how to make streets as unsafe as possible for vulnerable users. Like, it works for cars. You got a couple thousand pounds of metal around you, you're safe on our streets. You're on a bicycle or in a pair of sneakers, pushing a baby carriage, wheeling your wheelchair, you're doomed. And you saw, Gabe showed us the numbers. I mean, it's proven out in Florida. I give you this incredible moment of hope from Washington and the Biden administration when the bipartisan infrastructure law was passed. There's this tiny, tiny, tiny thing in there, which for me, other than the money, is one of the most important things that's going to happen to South Florida for complete streets. And that is that this manual for uniform traffic control devices is going to be completely rewritten. We should see a new version. Granted, it won't be till May 2023. But that will force changes in every state, including ours. The Green Book is going to have to change to manage that. And then most importantly is communities like ours, Miami-Dade County, Palm Beach County, Broward County, if we don't believe the Green Book in Florida with those changes is good enough for us to build the complete streets we need in urban areas, right? We understand Florida is a very rural county too. We now, under that law, have the ability to write our own manual, to work hand in hand with FHWA to say, we'd like our street design manual for crosswalks and pedestrian safety and cycling to differ slightly from the states. and they would work with us to get it approved. And that's already happening. Los Angeles is the first spot in the United States that's actually working to have a more robust manual around complete streets and human being mobility rather than car mobility. So it's exciting, and it's happening. It just hasn't happened, I think, as quickly as everybody in this room would like, because that's why we're here.
Thank you.
So, just building on that, I think one of the challenges is prioritizing both pedestrians and, since we're on the climate resilience panel, climate resilience. That if we are prioritizing people, whether they're pedestrians or public transit or light mobility, active mobility, we are also more likely to prioritize managing for heat. We're more likely to create more vegetation, which also helps manage for water, increased water. Certainly, it's not only that. We need to think about the right tree, right place, because with our hurricanes, we have to be very careful. We have to make it ADA compliant, so that provides constraints. But I think it's how we prioritize what are these right-of-ways for, and who for, and it's certainly through looking at mitigating for increasing flood risk, mitigating for heat, and also reducing our carbon emissions, we actually get to a more friendly, high-quality right-of-way environment, community environment. And so I think you can get there, but it takes making that the first goal.
Thanks, Jane.
And from an international perspective, I'll kind of take it up a notch. One of the things you guys talked about politics being a key impediment. Every image that I showed you, politics was an impediment there as well. So Amsterdam wasn't always Amsterdam. Amsterdam built giant streets and then they retrofitted them. Copenhagen wasn't Copenhagen. I showed you the image, they retrofitted it. Miami might be something different. How should Miami bounce forward? I think that's the challenge. And then getting these sort of pilot projects in communities shows how it works. So I'll do one quick story. In London, the same thing was happening. They had a program called the Mini Hollands program where they were figuring out how to incorporate complete streets into their communities. They were doing it in a business district, and the business leaders didn't want it, and they had a mock funeral for the business district. They carried a coffin. It was very theatrical. And then 2 years later, the business district was fine. Revenues were up, and they interviewed one of the people who was carrying the mock coffin, and he said, I was wrong. Showing in your own communities what works, once that happens in your community, someone else across in another neighborhood says, oh, I want that. This could work. And so moving from these kind of foreign planet examples from London or Copenhagen or Amsterdam, and then building them in your communities, I think is really a way to sort of build through those conflicts.
Thanks, Billy. All right, so the way that I've kind of synthesized the answers are, so not just the mind shift, right? We all know that we all participate in the transportation network, right? So the more that we ourselves drive, the more that we contribute to the issue. And so it becomes a personal mind shift, but also the political will. There's a question that actually talked about that. We frame it a lot on the political will and the political options that we have, but at the same time, we are constrained by the federal agencies and the state agencies that give us guidelines, for example. So if we look at right-of-ways and planting in right-of-ways, we have to work with FDOT to permit those things, right? And so some of those changes have to come either through context setting, right, Billy? So in the case of seeing what other examples, what other regions and cities have done would help a long way. And then, of course, being specific about what the needs are to address climate change through complete streets is really important, Jane. And that point is not lost on me on the sense of we can put a broad umbrella over resilient complete streets, but it needs to be specific, right? It needs to be clear. Okay, one of the things that came through and is a line on what I was hoping that people were gonna start asking questions in terms of what are these specific climate change manifestations that can be approached and addressed through complete streets. when we are building complete streets, how do we avoid producing more emissions? How do we avoid contributing to the problem that they're also trying to address? I'm curious to hear, Jane, specifically also from your work as the Chief Resilience Officer and now with Heat Officer, how you've balanced that discussion and those ideas in terms of the net output and then the net benefits gained from complete streets in this case.
In terms of the construction itself or the operations?
Both.
Well, you know, it's something that I think gets also to the barriers is rethinking how we finance these things and rethinking about the cost-benefit analysis that Gabe talked about is what's the long-term investment return on any of these investments, and the more that we look at those and the full costs, environmental, human health, economic costs of just business as usual versus something that may have materials that may have been more sustainably built, created, and installed, and certainly create a more sustainable ecosystem going forward. Those benefits need to be built in from the get-go, and that's something that's we're thinking about at the county is how do you fully capture that in the financial balance sheet of the county, so that as decisions are made forward, that they're brought. And to me, it's also about getting the right people at the table when you're designing a project. And sometimes, you know, we as we've designed project, we had road engineers, you know, and so how do you build a more integrated team with the landscape architects, with those that have the knowledge and expertise to really help think through some of the design challenges that you have in the right-of-way. I think that is the other piece. I don't know that I'm fully answering your question, but I think those are some of the things that we need to think differently, both how we financially think about these projects and then also the expertise you bring around the table.
I think that's right? If we look at triple bottom line cost-benefit analysis, and as opposed to a traditional cost-benefit analysis where we wouldn't be able to capture some of the benefits, social and environmental, I think we start having an easier business case for why it makes sense. And then for the emission standpoint, if that gets built into those cost-benefit analyses, then we actually start being able to measure. Because if you can measure it, you can change it, right? And so I think it starts from that idea, and you're absolutely right. Business as usual is definitely not going to show that complete streets that are geared for climate resilience are going to get us there. That's absolutely right. Billy, there was a question on what is about this belief that it's just too hot to walk, too hot to bike. Have you seen any cities around the world, any case studies that you can share?
Yeah, it's either too hot or too cold wherever you are. I'm in Texas, so it's always too hot. Meanwhile, like 8 months of the year, it's perfect. Like the same thing. It's really nice out there right now. Walking and biking is easy. A good example, though, is Seville in Spain. Seville is hot. It's about the same level heat here. It's actually probably hotter because they don't have that wonderful breeze coming off the ocean. But Seville, basically in the 2008 or so, built an integrated bicycle network. They basically created a series of protected bike lanes, and their mode share went flying upward. And I don't remember the exact numbers. It was somewhere around 2 or 3% mode share for bikes before, and then afterwards somewhere around 10%. And we're talking like temperatures 100, 105. Earlier we talked about the length of trips. Most trips are fairly short, so you're not going to sweat a lot on a short trip, and especially if you integrate electric bikes. Electric bikes are this real game changer in terms of the discussion about heat and temperature. Electric, if you've never been on one, you should jump on one. They're amazing. They transform trips, especially those short trips that most people are doing, into really something that's really easy and not something where you have to worry about heat.
That's absolutely right. I spent a month in Cairo doing some work there, And it was incredible to see so many people use multimodal forms of transportation, right? It's an incredibly dry, hot city and so dense, but also that density, I think, also talks to that accessibility. And of course, I lived in Boston. At the same time, people, they don't want to do anything outside in the winter, but you find ways. And also, as the mode of transportation and our networks become more accessible, they become friendlier to the usage of them by pedestrian or non-motorized travel, right? Okay, Commissioner Higgins, I want to, and this is going to be a big one. So there are questions on how to work, for example, with FDOT, right? There are guidelines that severely restrict planting in right-of-ways and medians. There's also the question of FPL. Are we working with FPL to make sure that their contributions to streets, right, their needs and infrastructure needs are being considered, and how do we negotiate with these two agencies, right? What does that look like, and what is needed to get them aligned with resilient, complete streets?
Well, I'm not sure I know the complete answer to that, but the first thing is you've got to call them and talk to them. And I will tell you, at least in District 6, from the FDOT perspective, I'll see if our Director of Transportation, Public Works nods his head, but I think we're having really great conversations with FDOT, and I think that is signaling, I think, change is, you always want change faster, and then as you go up into these large organizations, they really are designed to be careful and implement change more slowly. But I am finding we're having very good conversations with FDOT about how to build, where to build, making sure we're trying to move our transit passengers more quickly. Danny and I were just on a call 2 days ago where we're going to get rid of a lane of traffic for buses, and that idea came from FDOT. So, so I think, there you go. So part of it is this open dialogue of being persistent in what we need locally, that this matters to us. You're our state agency. We need you to enable us to do what we need to save our climate, to save from congestion, and to move our people. And I, for one, am very pleased with the conversations we're having with the Florida Department of Transportation on that. FPL is a big player in all kinds of things because, quite frankly, they're underground every bloody street. Every time you want to plant a tree, there's always some wire in the way. And so they have to be part of the discussion, particularly in redesigning streets from the ground up. And I'll give you an example. The Flagler Street project, if anybody walked by, you might see our namesake street torn up in a good way. That's going to become a complete street. It's going to become a festival street. And we really worked, and quite frankly, we didn't break ground on the project for a long time until we made sure we had all the undergrounding, which wasn't just FP&L, it was also all the fiber that might be needed. Because once you build a complete street, people want to live there and offices want to locate there, and that means there's more power needs and more communication needs. And we wanted to dig our street up once, not twice. And I'm not going to tell you that that was an easy nor a fast process, because it was not. But we got there, and I think what I can say is in FDOT, I think you're going to find a much more willing partner. At least that's been, my assessment of the change in the past year or two since I first got started working with them, and even having interesting discussions about what is landscaping. Right? FDOT always overspends their 1.5% that they have to do to green the roadways, but quite frankly, some of FDOT roadways are not complete streets, or they're not a street at all. They're a bridge, and we've even started the discussions about, could the greening be planting mangroves, right? So does landscaping have to be on the dirt, or can it be next to your bridges, which would make the bridges more resilient and also protect all of our neighborhoods from sea level rise? So I'm hopeful, and I think they sometimes find us bureaucratic too. So what goes around comes around.
I appreciate the shout out to mangroves as a Ocean Conservancy. Okay, so we're going to wrap up. I do want to give y'all one opportunity to tackle onto this idea of, once we actually break ground on a street, right? Like, who do we need at the table? As we know, reconstructing streets doesn't happen often, Once you build a street, to your point, Commissioner, it's many decades until you have to go back in or you have to do some large maintenance. But once we get to those opportunities, who should be invited to the table? Who do we need to make sure that's there so that they provide those ideas that make complete streets more resilient? And I think, Jane, you started talking about this, but I'll ask each of you to provide one expert that you would want at that table. And then we will close the Q&A.
Well, I think the first expert is the people who use the street. And so you need to make sure that they're absolutely at the table. And that's both the businesses as well as the residents.
Billy?
Yeah, and I would echo that. And I would start one notch earlier. Bringing people together, public health, Vision Zero, environment, economic development, and affordable housing all need to be at the table to start. That's really what our research showed, is that when you build those coalitions early, they're much more successful.
Agreed, and I appreciate the inclusion of affordable housing. And Commissioner Higgins?
There's nothing left to say. These people are smarter than me, so no, agree. It's everything from neighbors to businesses to developers. Don't forget about that, whether they're affordable housing developers or market rate or commercial developers. They know what they intend to build there. And if we don't create a street that works for them, it's going to be dug up again. And so we also do need to make sure that they have a seat at the table as well.
Thank you so much. And I'll add that as a designer, I definitely would advocate for the inclusion of more holistic design, right? If that's landscape architecture, then that's what it is. But a lot of urbanists nowadays would be very excited to be joining the table as well. Okay, with that, thank you so much for the great conversation. I appreciate your candid responses. Thank you so much for submitting the questions. And with that, we'll close this panel.